have to read it with the end in mind.
You have to.
And you can see little snippets, like chapter 3, I see a little snippet of what he's trying to get to.
I think so, but there's also very much a point in here, like, and this depends on when the book was written, but I mean, he takes a pretty interesting stance about animals and man go to the same resting place. You can tell there's not a really good understanding about eternity.
Well, of course, he's talking about they go back to the dirt.
Well, yeah, there's two different ones. They go back to the dirt, but then they all go to one place in verse 20. There's two different. A lot of people say it's two different things. They all go to one place, all are from the dust. So, like, the idea that they're equal. He's presenting that they're equal, not just dirt, but they're equal. So, like, because verse 21, who knows where the spirit of man goes up and the spirit of beast goes down. So, I don't know. It's interesting stuff, but it's all working towards the end for sure.
Yeah.
It has to be put into that context of heading that way. But this part here is not exactly sunshine and rainbows. Because even the justice part, like, there's no justice on earth. All right. It is time for us to get started. Got to make sure. So we are in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, and we'll start in verse 9 tonight. Let's, now we're good. Let's start with a prayer, though, and see who has my mics. I know Benny has a mic. I think John Dean has a mic. Eric, you have a mic? Okay. Benny, could you lead us in prayer? And we'll get started. Ooh, hot.
Our Holy Father, we thank you for a good day you've given us, and for this time this evening for us to be together and study your word. Pray that you would be with Terry and Chris as they lead our thoughts. Please guide them in that, and please help us to make proper and good applications to our lives. Help us to be more like Jesus every day, Father, and to be pleasing to you and do things that make you glad to call us your children. Please forgive us of our sins. Help us to put you first in what we do and say. These things we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
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 Okay, so we're going to pick up in verse 9 and go through the rest of the chapter together tonight. And I appreciate Chris sitting in. And I will let you know that I leave town Saturday. I come back next Thursday. So we have a guest speaker on Sunday. And Jared and Jason are going to be teaching next Wednesday night in chapter 4. So appreciative of that as well. Two things I wanted to share as we get started that as we keep trying to tune in and understanding our perspective. By this way, this word Qoleth is, it's the word for the preacher. It's the way that most of your commentators will refer to the author. Qoleth is a doubting wisdom teacher who struggles with the religious traditions of Israel, specifically with how their teachings square with human experience. And this is by Tripper Longman. Tripper Longman's really well respected in the area of Old Testament literature. Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes are kind of his wheelhouse. What I like about this is in ways we think about some of the traditional Jewish teachings of, like, the doctrine of retribution, which Job deals with, which is the idea, we get into justice a little bit tonight, which is the idea that, you know, if you do good, you get good. If you do bad, you get bad. And yet tonight he kind of says, well, in the place of justice, that doesn't exactly work that way. And he kind of comments on it. So he's struggling with that a little bit as he works through that. And this next quote is from a friend of mine who's preaches in Colorado now, but he's taught Old Testament, and he's got a PhD in Hebrew. He was raised, by the way, by a Jewish father. And he said, Ecclesiastes is written by an inspired author who does not know Jesus, and without Jesus, life is meaningless. The good news is we do know Jesus, but this, meaning the book of Ecclesiastes, is how those who don't know Jesus see the world. And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me today when he said it that way, because one of the things we're going to look at is kind of, what we're going to see today is more of this pattern of him surveying things under the sun and then coming to the conclusion that they don't have much value, so kind of ends with what's a carpe diem moment. So eat, drink, and be merry, seize the day. And when you think about this statement on the screen, if you don't know Jesus, what's life like here on earth? What meaning does it have? Nothing but seeking pleasures of this earth. And so that was one of the things that was really interesting, the way he put that. And the point he's making, which I think is good, is one of the values of Ecclesiastes is through this lens, we can see how people without God view life. And up until the end, the conclusion, which is where he comes to the right conclusion. And if it wasn't for the conclusion, Chris and I were just talking, and Chris, we can talk about this. If it wasn't for the conclusion and some nuggets we see, this would be a really depressing book when you think about it.
Yeah, I think we've got to read Ecclesiastes from the perspective. We've all probably had a conversation with someone where when they start talking, you're thinking, where are they going with this? I don't agree with anything they're saying. And then they'll make a point, and then you say, oh, okay, I get it. And you go back and you can kind of apply everything that they've said and understand it from the perspective of that they've now led you to understand. And so I think we almost have to read Ecclesiastes with the end in mind of the conclusion that he comes to. And I think when we do that, when we have his conclusion in mind, we see little windows or little snippets of what he's trying to lead us to understand along the way. My opinion is kind of we're in one of those sections here in chapter 3 at times, so kind of lead us to see that. But
yeah. So as we kind of dive into this, and we'll see all that, there's two main sections here. The first one is the problem with time. Verses 9 through 15 are really his commentary off of the poem in the first 8 verses, I think, is how I view that. He's kind of saying, well, because of all of this, now let's think about the application part of that text and then the problem with justice. And so one of the things that's interesting, this is the first Slido, is, here's the statement, he's made all things beautiful or made everything beautiful in his time, and we have a beautiful song that's written off that idea. And this is just an opinion, by the way, when you think of that statement in the context of Ecclesiastes, by the way, you think that he's making that as a positive statement or as a negative statement? And that's kind of a challenging question to think of. So just give your best guess, and we'll talk about it a little bit and see what you think from that standpoint. I will tell you, I know that the song in our hymn book based off that statement is extremely positive, right? He makes all things beautiful in his time, and it kind of is a song about us waiting on God. So that's really interesting to think from that standpoint. So as you're answering that, we'll kind of get into this, because verse 9 says, what gain has the worker from his toil? And by the way, that's a return back to chapter 1. Chapter 1 has, I think it's about verse 2 or 3, has in there this idea of what does man gain by all the toil that he has? And so there's a connection, and you'll see there's just a lot of connections back and forth between Ecclesiastes, and it's interesting from that standpoint. So in this idea here, in verses 9 through 15, Chris, kind of what do you see him saying there? I know you've mentioned there's snippets of things, but what's your kind of perspective that he's saying here?
Well, I've got a lot of, I guess I've got too much to say, but I think in going back, and I take the very beginning of chapter 3, there is an appointed time. If you go back to chapter 2, I think he's kind of nudging us to the perspective that it is meaningless unless there is someone in control, unless there is somebody who is in control and appointing things and making things beautiful or appropriate in its time. And when you look at all these times, you're really seeing two opposites, right? You're seeing two ends of the spectrum: to live, a time to be born, a time to die, and on and on and on. And as you go down, you could almost categorize them, because the first few tend to deal with life and death. There's the next few seem to deal with emotions, time to weep and laugh, mourn, dance. There's some that almost seem to deal with, like verse 6 and 7, with prosperity, or either gaining things or not. There's a time to lose and a time to time to keep and a time to throw away. And the last part seems to me kind of a bit about relationships. So it's almost as if the preacher is encompassing everything in life. There's a time for everything from one end of the spectrum to the other. And basically you have no control over it, but there is somebody who does. And I think that's what he's trying to get us to understand. So when he asks the question in verse 9, what profit is there to the worker if there is someone who is in control of these things? That's the logical question that you're led to ask. Well, what profit is there to the one who's actually living these things and going through them?
Yeah. It's interesting because I agree with all that. And I tell you, verse 8 is the one that I struggle with the most of the things that God's appointed. And there's no doubt that I think he's applying that to God. But there's a time to love, a time to hate, a time for war, and a time for peace. And you're kind of like, well, that doesn't sound very godlike, does it? Except it does when you think about it. And it's interesting here, this idea, I've seen the business that God has given the children of man to be busy with. Another word for that could be burden, that God has placed a burden upon man. And the burden is the toil or the work. I mean, that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. Even in the garden, man had to work to tend and keep the garden. It just wasn't the toil and labor it becomes after the fall of man. But it's interesting, too, he put eternity into his heart, and that word eternity is a really hard word to translate, by the way, and this is where Hebrew is far more difficult to translate than Greek, far more difficult to translate. And this word could be durability, it could be ignorance, and that's the issue here. What it seems to be, though, is that in some ways the preacher is saying that God has made man with a little bit of the same ability as God as far as eternity and that kind of idea, or durability, except in this context, man is not in control, God is in control. And it's kind of a trick question on the Slido, because to be honest with you, it's a little bit of both, I think. Part of it is, yes, God's in control, and so everything's going to go correctly. Part of it's also, God puts just enough in us that we have this ability, and I think this is one of man's frustration today, that we are even somewhat capable in our own minds of thinking like God, and yet we can't control things. We will never be in control. And in a sense, in this seeking out of wisdom and how to find meaning in life, part of this is, I think, a futility of, I can understand things to a point, but I'll never be able to control them. And since I can't control them, and God's going to control everything, then what am I going to do? Eat, drink, and be merry. Seize the day. That's a seize the day statement there in verse 13. I perceive there's nothing better than to be joyful, to do good as long as they live. Now that be joyful and do good, we think about statements like from Micah 6:8 or for Ephesians 2, created for his workmanship. But the idea of do good here is more the idea of just enjoying life on the earth under the sun, not necessarily doing good for God. It's really just pleasure in pursuing things for yourself in this language is the idea here. And so again, it's kind of this, okay, so God's in control, but since God's in control, what am I going to do? What do I have to look forward to? And so whatever God, and that takes you to verse 14, and get Scott a mic, by the way, Benny, because he had his hand up. Whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nothing taken away from it. So God's completely in control. I can't do anything about that. And it's because of that, at the end of verse 14, people fear him. Now the word fear here, by the way, is not the reverent fear, it's the afraid fear. Because God's in control, people respond to God because they're afraid of him. And it's kind of interesting to see it that way. Scott? Okay. And the hard thing to keep in mind is that it's like I said, it's almost both things. Like Chris says, there's a part of this where God's in control, and that's a beautiful thing. But for somebody who's seeking wisdom and is a king and has power, that's a struggle. That's an internal struggle that I can't. And it goes back to, remember in chapter 1, one of the things we talked about was, one of the problems is that the generations come and go, and once you die, nobody remembers you. And so as he seeks greatness under the sun, this adds to the fact that there's nothing he can do that can be great, because God's in control and he's not in control. Now, go back to what I said about Jesus. For us, understanding God's plan for man, that's a beautiful thing that God's in control. But for those who don't believe and don't understand, that's meaningless to them. And so as a result, they have that does nothing for them. And that's kind of part of what's being seen here. Does that make sense? Any questions, follow-up comments, anything to add to that?
Yeah, occupy in verse 10 is it really has a negative, like Terry said. It's and if you don't see, if you're only looking at the perspective from under the sun, trying to figure all that out, the word occupy. Does anybody's version render something different there? In verse 10. Okay. It literally means like to browbeat, to self-afflict, or to depress. And so if you're looking at it from that perspective, it is depressing, isn't it? I mean, it is you're trying your best. I mean, how many people every day try to figure out the origin of this and that? And it's depressing. But when he says he has made everything appropriate, and when he says he has set eternity in their heart, I think about kind of like what Terry was saying. We have a bit of that. We have a grasp of it. I can think back to what I got for my 4th birthday. I remember my 4th birthday present. But if I were to try to retrace my steps and do exactly what I did yesterday, I'd have no idea. And so I can't even remember exactly what I did yesterday, much less control anything from the past. I can plan things for the future, and yet we know that we have no control over that. So we have this kind of a concept or a grasp of time going backwards and forwards. But he says, yet God has set it in our heart that we will not find it out. And to me, I see a little bit of grace in that. I would just throw that out there. Can you see where there would be a little bit of grace in that, and why?
I can see it with Jesus, right? I mean, that gets to the point of when you have that relationship with God, I see grace. When you don't have that relationship with God, it is more the occupation of the oppression, I think, in that sense.
Yeah, I think about Romans 7 when Paul told us what the purpose of the law was. Paul said it reveals what sin is. I wouldn't have known what sin is if it hadn't been for the law. And when I saw what the law was, it produced in me every kind of coveting there was. It even roused sin. He says the command which was to result in life proved to result in death for me. I understood that it killed me and ruined me. And then looking back, I see how utterly sinful sin is. So the law is very gracious in the fact that it causes us to look beyond the law to something greater. We have to look beyond the one who fulfilled the law. And I think the fact that God has given us this concept of eternity in our heart, but yet we can't figure it out, I think there's a grace in that, and that it's causing us to look beyond the sun to know that there's somebody who is appointing things and making things appropriate and beautiful. And we're forced almost to look beyond this earth for an answer.
Yeah. I'm going to read from the Message Bible, a few verses here, and I don't normally do that, but sometimes they really hit it, and I think this is one of those times. In the end, does it really make a difference what anyone does? I've had a good look at what God has given us to do. Busy work mostly. True, God made everything beautiful in itself and its time, but he left us in the dark so we can never know what God is up to, whether he's coming or going. I've decided there's nothing better to do than go ahead and have a good time and get the most we can out of life. That's it. Eat, drink, and make the most of your job. It's God's gift. I've also concluded that whatever God does, that's the way it's going to be always. No addition, no subtraction. God's done it. That's it. So we'll quit asking questions and simply worship in holy fear. And that's kind of a good summation. It's not the message is never a word for word, by the way. It's kind of a paraphrase. But sometimes I think it does a really good job of helping us understand some of these older texts, especially, as they put it into more modern day language. And that's kind of what happens there. I think it's pretty interesting to read that from that perspective. And again, as Chris says, when you look past the sun, there's a grace and a hope and a faith and those kind of things that are great. But when you only look under the sun, this is a pretty dismal kind of look at things.
So being able to come to that conclusion is a gift.
Yeah, it is
Being
a
able
gift.
to
Yeah.
being able to look to something beyond.
Absolutely. Well, let's move to I think verse 16 starting, and just here he enters into this area of justice. So what does he see about justice? And that's kind of what he goes. He goes to the place of justice in verse 16. And maybe one thing to start off with is what we think the place of justice refers to. It's a poetic statement. I don't think that's really too difficult when you just think about what the place of justice would be. What would that be?
Judgment.
Judgment, okay, but where does judgment happen? In a courtroom. And again, remember, we're under the sun, so let's not think day of judgment or the Lord coming or the Lord's day. He's going to the legal courtroom, and he's looking at man's justice through the legal courtroom. And that's important because of the conclusion that he comes to about justice. It's not divine justice. And that's not what he's talking about. So again, we have to Chris's point earlier, you got to look beyond the sun to find this hope and grace. But to understand what he's saying a lot of time, we can't look past the sun yet. We have to look under the sun and see the things there. So he goes to the courtroom. So we say, what did he see about justice? What does he see in the courtroom about justice? There's one answer so far. It says there was wickedness. Eric, you had the mic. You're gonna. No. I thought you were going to say something. Okay. What does he see in the place of justice in the courts? Corruption? How so? How does he describe the corruption? Maybe.
Because even in this place where there should be righteousness, there was wickedness everywhere.
Okay.
Is that what you wanted?
Should be. By the way, righteousness and justice are actually synonyms. I think we sometimes forget that. You'll see them used interchangeably. This is a parallel statement. I think he's kind of doubling down here, in my opinion, that in the place of justice there was wickedness, in the place of righteousness there was wickedness. He sees wickedness, there's corruption. That you should be able to find justice, but instead you find corruption. And that's really important here, because we cling to the idea of justice, right? And yet, he's saying there is no justice. He's kind of starting off with that statement of, I go to the place of justice and there's wickedness instead of justice. So that's the way corruption is seen there. So what does he say then in response to that? What's his response? Or what is his next statement? If man's courts are corrupt, what does he say? Okay? God's going to judge. And I think this is one of those little snippets, like you said, if we read from the end, like if we read the last chapter first, then we can kind of go, okay, he's starting to build this little case along the way. Right, Chris?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah.
I agree. Even like you're saying, even on this earth where there should be a place of course, we understand it to be God ordained, a place for righteousness and justice. It's not even there.
Yeah.
Well, he's describing it. He's putting us right in there with animals. He said,
Yeah,
you know,
he's going to.
Yeah, he said, hey, we find out that we're no better than a beast.
Right. Yeah, that's where he's headed. So he says here, God's going to judge the righteous and the wicked, for there's a time for every matter and every work. Now that's really strong to the conclusion at the end of the book. If you go read chapter 12, he talks about how he's going to bring every work into judgment, whether it's public or private, basically. So we kind of get that snippet here of where he's headed, but he's not headed there yet. And that's the interesting thing. I see, I agree with Chris. He's kind of putting these things in there along the way to kind of get us to think that way. But then he kind of pulls back and he gets back under the sun and basically says, here's where we're going. But here, this is how this looks. This is pretty bad. So again, God's going to control this. But then in verse 18, notice what he says. I said in my heart with regard to the children of man that God is testing them that they may see that they themselves are but beasts. Is that a difficult statement to kind of come to grips with, that God's testing us to see if we're better than animals?
That's one of those again where when I click on the word and see what it means, I'm like, why did they put tested?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's too hard.
Yeah, Strong's defines it as like almost like polished. He shined it. It's almost like he's saying God has made it obvious. God has wiped away where you can see that there's really under the sun there's no advantage between man and beast. Some of the translations you have to wonder when you see the meaning of the word, why did they pick that word? But when I see it that way, it kind of makes it clear, no pun intended, of what maybe a little bit more of what his point is, that God has made it obvious. If you're following the earthly logic, well, there is no difference.
Right. And ultimately, that's what he's saying. I'll read from the Message Bible again just because I went to check it. It's pretty good. Human and animals come to the same end. Humans die, animals die. We all breathe the same air, so there's no real advantage in being human. Nothing. Everyone's smoke. We all up in the same place. We all come from dust. We all end up as dust. Now, again, that's a pretty negative, kind of depressing way to look at it. If you only see things under the sun, and also, today as I thought about that, if you really don't have a view of eternity and of an afterlife, of God and grace and all those things, then you can see why sin persists and why people do whatever they want to do, because this is the baseline understanding. Without all those things, we're just going to the grave anyway. There's nothing to be afraid of, and there's nothing to look forward to. So, carpe diem. Save the day, seize the day. You do whatever you want to do while you're here, because there's no value to your life under the sun when you look at it this way. Now, again, we know that he's going to get to a different conclusion, but at this point, that's what he's trying to say. If you're looking under the sun and not past it, you're no different than the animals. Your end is the same. And you've heard me say this before. There's not a lot, there's no full understanding of eternity, immortality, being glorified like the Savior, resurrection. There's not a full understanding of that till after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There are some hints along the way that actually, kind of like what Chris is saying, sometimes we read backwards from that moment and we see these little things that are building to that point, but they're not much more than shadowy figures, truthfully, until this full revelation of the mystery is God raised him from the dead. And so we have that, but even here, this is a pretty common thinking of the ancients. It's more common to think that you die and your body goes back to dust and nothing else happens than an eternity of immortality in any form or an afterlife. That's one of those is much more common. And so he's dealing with all of that here, and that idea of we're just like animals and nothing better than that. So again, when you think about that, that's pretty depressing. If that's all you knew, right? I mean, the only thing about that is this idea, and it helps us understand why he keeps coming back to life is meaningless. So just go out and eat, drink, and be merry. Because if this is the idea and the fundamental conclusion he's going to come to over and over again, well, then there's nothing else to look forward to.
Yeah. I even see a little bit of hope in that statement than just, going back to what he said in verse 13. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor, and that being a gift. And I think that's what I kind of made the comment from the audience last week, that it reminded me of what Paul said in Philippians 4 about being content in all things, no matter what the circumstance. And when you come to that conclusion, it is very comforting to know that I just need to enjoy and be content in the situation that I'm in, and do exactly what he said, see the good in it in my work.
I would put that in a very above the sun though perspective, I guess, because that's seeing God, right, and seeing it as a gift. Whereas if you don't know God, It's just total pleasure. It's for lack of a better term, it's self-seeking. And those being the distinctions. But yeah, absolutely. The contentment there, part of this is, if God controls everything, you should just be content with what you have. And if you understand that relationship with God, then yes. If you don't have that relationship with God, it's not even seen as a gift, obviously. This is also a return in this section here, a return to the theme of death that we saw brought up in chapter 1. He's somewhat consumed with dying. It feels like he is talking about what am I going to be remembered for when I'm gone? I'm going to die. And this goes back to that, even the opening poem, that generations come and go and nobody remembers them. What value is there if you and animals go back to the same place? Death is coming for all of us. We all breathe the same thing. We all go to the same place. Everything about that is vanity. And in the end, nobody knows anything. Nobody sees value. Nobody remembers anything. So they get to verse 22. So there's nothing that a man should do but rejoice in his work, for that's his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? Once you're dead, not only do they forget you, but you can't be a part of whatever happens after you're dead. So just do your work. Now, when we add the above the sun perspective to this, then that idea of working gets into that idea of contentment and trusting in God and those kind of things. But if we're just under the sun, which is what a lot of this is talking about, then it's kind of got a more negative idea here of, well, once you figure out you're going to die just like the animals, then what you need to do is just work so you can eat and be merry, because that's all you have to live for at the end of the day. Again, you kind of see this two different views, and we've talked about all along when I've been teaching that we have this dual worldview of an eternity and a temporal, but the under the sun is so often here the idea of just what we see on earth. What are the things that you see there, Chris, from that last section?
Yeah, I don't really think I have anything to add. I think he's saying the same thing. He goes back to the frustration in verse 21. Who knows? Who knows? If this is the case, what's the difference? If man and beast both go to the same place, if their end is the same, well, then who knows why one of us is upright and our breath goes up, and the beast is made the other way, and I almost see him as saying, I'm going back to the frustration of who can understand any of it, so.
Yeah, Longman says of that, it's a rhetorical question. He says it doesn't deny necessarily the possibility of an afterlife, but this is the key. It does deny a certainty about the afterlife. That even if you have an idea that there's something after here, his perspective is there's no way for you to be certain of that. Now, it goes back to what I said earlier. Once the resurrection of Jesus happened, that's where our faith and the certainty, in fact, that's the argument 1 Corinthians 15 makes, is that if Jesus is raised from the dead, then we're all going to be raised from the dead. But if he's not raised from the dead, then nobody's going to be raised from the dead. And that the one historical moment that proves the afterlife is what happens on that third day after he's crucified. So this idea of, well, who knows? There's no way to know at this point. And the uncertainty here means just go to work, eat, drink, and be merry. I had a third slide. We just talked about that, so we'll skip that. So let's get into, in our last few minutes, maybe here, the 4 questions. What have you learned from this reading? What are some things that you've learned from the reading today? And anybody's welcome to answer that.
The repetition in verse 16.
Okay?
I looked it up, I didn't just go what he said.
Yeah.
So the word righteousness is justice, so repetition,
Yep.
which is poetic. It's a figurative, it's figurative.
Yeah, Hebrew poetry is always that parallel statements like that. If you go to, we've talked about that a lot, if you go to Psalms, Proverbs especially, you should be able to see those parallel statements, and they're either, a lot of times they're restating the same thing, or sometimes they're opposites, but they always are looking into that, helps you understand what they're saying. And his is a parallel where it's restating. So yeah, it is very poetic. Wisdom literature is generally written in poetry, although Ecclesiastes is still considered wisdom literature, even though it's got more prose than poetry. It's one of the oddballs of the Old Testament in that sense. What else? What else maybe have you learned from the reading? Nobody?
Just how much peace and rest we get with Jesus. Because we already talked about it. If you're not in Jesus, then you're going to spend so much time and energy either trying to find meaning in this life, ultimately coming up with vanities, or you come to the conclusion that life means nothing, which is a pretty depressing, sad conclusion as well. And so, without there being something more, Jesus gives us peace and rest. So much anxiety for me comes from trying to control things, and I need to just turn things over to God. Because even in Solomon recognizes I can't control things, but there's just peace and rest that comes from giving that up to God, and not trying to control things, not trying to make a name for myself here, realizing that all this is toil, this is vanity. That's actually peaceful for me because there's something more.
That's a great comment, and I like how you said, I can't control things, and he even realizes. I mean, he's described as a king, right? And so whoever wrote this views this from a kingly perspective, whether that's Solomon or not. Like I've said all along, I'm not going to get into that debate because it doesn't really matter. But here's somebody who has power, who has wisdom, and at the end of the day, what's really powerful about this is he comes to this conclusion that he can't control things. And yet we still, thousands of years later, are trying to do what he's already come to the conclusion is impossible to do. There's a part of this where we need to just be able to say, hey, God's in control. God's going to take care of these things. And it's not my job to try to fight with God about that.
Yeah, I made a note on kind of along the lines of what Jared said. I thought about as I was reading this again earlier today about Matthew 6, where in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is telling us not to worry. Look at the birds of the air. They don't sow, they don't reap, they don't gather in the barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? Who by being worried can add a single hour to his life? Isn't that exactly what we're talking about here? I mean, trying to figure all this out, it's just there's no point to it. And the thing that kind of made me chuckle is when he says in verse 29, he's talking about the lilies of the field. They neither toil nor do they spin. Yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. And then he goes on to say, how much more will he clothe you, you of little faith? So I just thought that was kind of interesting. If we, if this indeed is Solomon, it's just kind of to that point. You see the wisdom even back here in him saying, quit trying to figure it out, quit trying to worry about it. Again, be happy in the things, be happy in your lot that you've been given.
Yeah, happy and content. Absolutely. You had your hand up?
Yeah, I like how Jared said the word rest, because that's what it does. And if not, back to what he said with me, it's depressing. It's super depressing. It's actually really depressing. And I don't know, if I was not a Christian, I would be, I don't know, it's either always constant chasing or just nothing. And I try to remember back, because I didn't become a Christian, so I was 24, and I try to remember back, like, how I thought. And honestly, like, I know we say it's depressing, but it's not on people's minds. Sometimes it's just nothing.
Right.
And then, even in the way you grow up, like, my dad was an addict, so we had that addict mentality, like, we made it through this day, we're done. There's nothing after. We just, like, we're chill.
And that's the seize the day mentality, like just live in today, don't think about anything else. Don't even think about the consequences of what you do today tomorrow. Just make it through today. And if you make it through today, then we're good. And that's kind of the under the sun mentality that he's kind of, in some ways, painting this picture of is, hey, if none of this matters, just eat, drink, and be merry, get today, go to work, get through the day, have fun doing it, and then live tomorrow. Live tomorrow for tomorrow. And you never think beyond the next moment. And it's interesting because when you work with addicts, one of the ways to work with addicts is to get them to do what's called do the next right thing, because they only think one step ahead. So the kind of the mantra is make sure that next step is the right step. And that's kind of the first step in trying to reprogram their thinking in that way. So it's pretty interesting. Anybody else?
Certainly makes you appreciate the faithfulness of some of the patriarchs in the Bible too. That their promises were, who knows what they thought about eternity, or if they thought about it. A lot of what they were promised was just what he's talking about is your sons and your generations, and they'll be as numerous as the stars in the sky, that kind of stuff. It's out there, and they didn't have the knowledge that we had about eternity. So their faithfulness really says something about their trust in God.
I think it helps us understand their faithfulness and their weakness, because all those patriarchs also have lots of flaws. But part of why they have flaws is because they don't have the full understanding that we have. But they're also human, and we still have those same flaws, which is what is interesting, I think. Let me, just for sake of time, where do you fall short according to this? I mean, we've probably talked about some of that. I know for me, the idea of trying to control things is a big area where I know I fall short, is this idea of like I can control my own destiny. That's just very flawed thinking.
I don't think about eternity enough, honestly. I live like there's no eternity, and then every now and again it hits me, So I don't think about it. I don't dwell on it, and I mean that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
Is to be in heaven, and so I don't think about it enough. I don't dwell on it enough, and then so I behave just like he's talking about, to live for the day.
Yeah, sometimes we're exiles that don't live like we're exiles.
It's easy to read Matthew 6. It's harder to put it into practice.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? Yeah, it is. And Matthew 6 is a great reading there, because it is always amazes me where he talks about, you know how God takes care of everything else, and you're the crowning achievement of creation. I mean, Matthew 6 is predicated on the exact opposite of what the end of chapter 3 is talking about. I mean, Matthew 6 is saying, you are better than the beast, right? That's one of the major differences. Like, look at how God takes care of the animal kingdom, and you're worth more than that. You're better than that, which is powerful to think about. But I think you're right, Eric. I think a lot of times we have a very under the sun mentality. Yeah, Scott?
I think it's interesting too, you're talking about the content. I think it's better too when
You're on. It's on.
when you talk about the contentment, as Lisa was talking about, if you don't have God and you're not thinking about God and you just get through the day, content for the day, that you got through it and all those types of things, a lot of times you're not worried about other things because you don't think about God, right? But there again, on the flip side of that, when we have God, we have rest, as was said, because of our faith and understanding there. And then God tells us, don't worry, okay? He tells us to take it a day at a time, right? Obviously, we know where our future lies at that point. And he says, there's enough worry today, so don't worry about tomorrow.
Yep.
So, but it goes from under the sun to above, right? But that contentment that we can have with that is ultimately knowing where we are headed, right?
Right.
And it is that eternity. Whereas,
And very much who's in control.
yeah, right. And who's in control? Here, well, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, and, okay, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is, okay, it's done.
Yeah. Yep.
I totally feel what Eric is saying, because when I'm at school, like in the culture that I'm in, me and this other teacher, our new motto is stay alive till 3:05. And it's so true. And so while I'm in there and I've got 30 kids in the room and then I got some trying to come in, I'm not thinking about, okay, let me stop. Let me think about heaven for a moment. I'm being real.
Right.
Like, I'm trying to survive right now. So I get it. Same,
That's also me, by the way, even though I'm in that room over there. I'm thinking about how do I write this sermon and get it done on time and everything I have to get done. I'm not thinking about heaven. And Don't let that alarm you. It's still work. And I think most of us, when we're working, regardless of whether it's that work or my work or whatever, we get so focused on the task that we don't think about the future. We don't have the right perspective about things. I think that's really important. What do you need to change according to this reading? I mean, a lot of that, it seems like we've talked about a lot of that, but what are some things to change?
Do more than just stay alive till 3:05.
Thrive till 3:05. There we go. Thrive till 3:05. There's your new motto. Chris, what thoughts do you have about any of this? Anything that maybe impacted you from today?
One of the biggest things to me is just the thankfulness for God being in control, the fact that He's a sovereign God, and even though no matter how hard it is, like we said, to stop worrying and to want to try and plan and change things and never be content seemingly with certain things in your life, just to stop and be thankful for what He's given you, and be thankful that I can't control any of it, because He certainly, the two verses that He says in verse 11, He has made everything beautiful. And verse 14, I know that everything God does, made and does is the same word. So everything God makes or does is beautiful. Everything He makes or does is eternal. And so I shouldn't be worried about trying to gain control.
And those are words that are found in Genesis 1 and 2 also. It's interesting, the word made there. One of the things about the control thing I thought about, and I'll use this illustration. I have a handrail I'm working on at home, and I had these pieces of lumber I need to split at an angle and layer, just because that's the scrap that I had. And so I did that, and I went to put them up, and when I butted them up, it was 2 inches short because I did my math wrong. And as I was studying this today, I was thinking, thought about that. This is why I'm not in control, is because I don't make things beautiful. I mess them up, right? Now, I got to go back to Lowe's and buy another piece of lumber now because I wasted the materials that I already had. And so I've got to fix that. I've got to do a whole new thing. And part of this is just not wanting control, but also just realizing I'm better off by letting God be in control. Because God can make it beautiful. I can't. I know how to mess things up. And I think that's the one thing that I need to change. And what habits do you need to develop according to this chapter? We're out of time. Let me leave you with this, the perspective I started with. I think part of the value of this study is for us to realize just the thinking process of the lost and why they need to be shared the good news about Jesus so they can think beyond the Son. I think there's a very much, if we can gain that perspective as we study through this book, that those times where we look at this and go, wow, this is pretty depressing, hopefully that would motivate us to think about the people around us, that's how they think, so that we can share life above the sun with them. This is the time where the preacher says the corny, or life with the Son, S-O-N. That's when we share that with them so that they can know there's much more to life, that we share the conclusion of the book with them rather than this pessimistic view of life without the conclusion. And if we could all develop those habits, I think the world would be a better place. So we're out of time. Thank you, Chris, for tonight, and thank you for your participation.
You ever heard of John Lennox?